You've just spent 30 years climbing the corporate ladder. Every morning at 6:30 a.m. sharp, you're up and at 'em, suit pressed, coffee in hand, ready to tackle another day in the accounting department of a mid-sized company in suburban Cleveland. That was Robert Wilson's life for 3 decades. But at 62, Bob, as his friends called him, had finally reached that golden milestone: retirement. This is it, Bob thought to himself on his first Monday morning as a free man. Finally, I get to live life on my own terms. For Bob, retirement felt like winning the lottery. No more demanding deadlines, no more office politics, no more 2-hour commutes through Ohio traffic. He had dreams, big dreams. Travel cross-country with Linda, his wife of 35 years. Take up photography. Maybe learn to play guitar. The world was his oyster. But here's where our story takes an interesting turn, because Linda Wilson saw things very differently. At 58, Linda had spent the last 5 years building something that was entirely her own. A charming little flower shop called Blooms and Petals, right there in their neighborhood. While Bob had been buried in spreadsheets and quarterly reports, Linda had discovered a passion she never knew she had. She loved the early morning trips to the flower market, the creative arrangements, the regular customers who'd become like family. For the first time in decades, Linda felt, well, free. And now, suddenly, Bob was home. All day, every day. Honey, Bob would say, appearing in the kitchen while Linda was trying to enjoy her morning coffee and plan her day. What's on the agenda today? Need help at the shop? At first, Linda tried to be patient. Oh, that's sweet of you to offer, but I've got it handled. But Bob wasn't easily discouraged. He'd show up at Blooms and Petals around lunchtime, offering suggestions about the window display or questioning why she was ordering so many roses. You know, Linda, from a business perspective, those margins seem a little tight on the premium bouquets. Linda would smile politely, but inside, she was screaming. This was her space, her business, her sanctuary. And now Bob was treating it like another corporate project to optimize. The evenings were no better. Bob had grand plans: let's plan a trip to Yellowstone, let's renovate the guest bathroom, let's learn ballroom dancing together. His retirement fantasies all involved the two of them, joined at the hip, making up for lost time. But Linda? She had different ideas. Bob, I love you, she'd say, but I've just found my independence. I'm not ready to give that up. You see, while Bob saw retirement as the beginning of their golden years together, Linda saw it as something else entirely. For 30 years, her life had revolved around Bob's schedule, Bob's career, Bob's needs. When he worked late, she ate dinner alone. When he traveled for business, she managed everything at home. When he was stressed about quarterly reports, she was his sounding board and emotional support. And now, just when Linda had finally carved out her own identity, her own purpose, her own rhythm, here was Bob, expecting her to drop everything and become his full-time retirement companion. The tension started small. Bob would reorganize the kitchen while Linda was at work, just trying to be helpful, but it drove her crazy. She had a system, a way of doing things that worked for her. Bob would suggest they go out to dinner on nights when Linda just wanted to come home, put on her pajamas, and watch her favorite shows. We have all the time in the world now, Bob would say, not understanding why Linda seemed to be pulling away. But Linda was thinking, I've been living on someone else's schedule for 30 years. Can't I just have a moment to breathe? Their conversations became shorter, their evenings quieter. Bob couldn't understand why his wife wasn't as excited about their newfound freedom as he was. And Linda couldn't explain that what felt like freedom to him felt like another cage to her. Friends and neighbors started to notice. At the local coffee shop, Bob would sit alone, reading the paper, looking a little lost. Linda would rush through her errands, always seeming like she was trying to get somewhere else. This is the story of two people who loved each other deeply but who had completely different visions of what their next chapter should look like. Bob dreamed of togetherness, finally having the time to reconnect and rediscover each other. Linda dreamed of independence, the chance to fully explore who she was outside of being someone's wife. Neither of them was wrong. But they were heading in opposite directions, and neither one knew how to bridge that growing gap. What happens when the life you've been looking forward to becomes the thing that drives you apart? When retirement, something that's supposed to bring joy and freedom, becomes the source of your biggest conflict? Bob and Linda Wilson were about to find out, and their journey would change both of their lives in ways they never could have imagined. Now, if you've ever been in a relationship that's starting to fall apart, you know the signs. They're subtle at first, so subtle you almost convince yourself you're imagining things. For Bob Wilson, those signs started showing up about 6 months into his retirement. Linda began staying out later and later. "Oh, I had to reorganize the entire back room at the shop," she'd say, coming home at 9 p.m. when the flower shop officially closed at 6. You know how it is, inventory takes forever. But Bob noticed other things too. Linda started paying more attention to her appearance. New clothes appeared in her closet, not the practical work outfits she'd worn for years, but stylish blouses and well-fitted jeans. She'd spend extra time in the bathroom in the mornings, carefully applying makeup for what she claimed was just another day at the flower shop. Bob tried to push down the gnawing feeling in his gut. After 35 years of marriage, surely he was just being paranoid, right? Linda deserved to feel good about herself. The flower shop business was probably just picking up. But then came that Tuesday afternoon that changed everything. Bob had decided to surprise Linda with lunch, maybe swing by Blooms and Petals, with sandwiches from that deli she liked. As he walked toward the town square, he spotted the familiar red awning of Café Luna, the little coffee shop across from Linda's store. And there she was. Linda was sitting at a corner table, and she wasn't alone. Across from her sat a man Bob had never seen before, probably in his early 60s, with salt and pepper hair and an easy smile. But what stopped Bob cold wasn't just that Linda was having coffee with a stranger. It was the way she was laughing. Bob hadn't heard Linda laugh like that in months. It was the kind of genuine, delighted laughter that lit up her whole face. The kind of laugh that used to be reserved for him. She was leaning forward, animated, gesturing with her hands as she told some story. The man was hanging on every word. Bob stood frozen on the sidewalk, sandwiches growing heavy in his hands. He watched as the stranger reached across the table and briefly touched Linda's hand. Linda didn't pull away. The betrayal hit Bob like a physical blow. His chest tightened, his hands started shaking. Every instinct told him to march into that cafe and confront them both. But his feet wouldn't move. Instead, he turned around and walked home, the untouched sandwiches ending up in the kitchen trash. That night, Bob couldn't sleep. He lay in bed next to Linda, listening to her breathe, wondering how long this had been going on. When she'd gotten home at her usual late hour, she'd kissed his cheek and asked about his day as if nothing had happened. "How was the shop today?" Bob had asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Oh, you know, same old routine," Linda replied, not meeting his eyes. 3 days later, Bob couldn't take it anymore. He waited until Linda came home from what she claimed was inventory night at the shop. "We need to talk," Bob said as Linda hung up her coat. Something in his tone made Linda freeze. She turned to face him, and Bob saw something flicker across her expression, guilt, maybe, or just resignation. "About what?" she asked quietly. "About whoever you were having coffee with at Café Luna on Tuesday." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Linda's shoulders sagged, and for a moment, she looked older than her 58 years. "Bob," she said finally, her voice steady but tired. "I can't do this anymore. I can't pretend that things between us are fine when they're not." "So you're having an affair?" The words came out harsher than Bob intended. Linda shook her head. It's not what you think. David is just a friend. Someone I can talk to who doesn't try to fix everything or tell me how to run my business or plan my entire day around his schedule." "David?" Bob felt like he'd been slapped. "Bob, listen to me." Linda sat down heavily on their couch. "I'm suffocating. I've been suffocating for months. Ever since you retired, I feel like I can't breathe in my own life. You want to be together every moment, but you don't want to be with me. You want me to be the wife. You think I should be the retirement companion you've been planning for." Bob stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "I love you, Linda. I just want us to enjoy our time together. But what about what I want?" Linda's voice rose slightly. "Bob, I don't want to go back to the way things were. I can't go back to organizing my entire life around yours. I finally found myself, and I won't give that up again." Sometimes, a marriage doesn't end with a dramatic fight or a single moment of betrayal. Sometimes it just dies, slowly, quietly, like a plant that's been forgotten in a corner. Over the next few weeks, Bob and Linda tried counseling. They had awkward conversations over dinner. They attempted to work things out, the way couples are supposed to. But the distance between them only grew wider. Linda started spending even more time away from home. Bob became increasingly bitter and suspicious. The trust that had taken 35 years to build crumbled in a matter of months. The final blow came when Bob hired a private investigator, something he never thought he'd do in a million years. The photos were devastating: Linda and David walking hand in hand through Riverside Park, David kissing Linda goodbye outside her flower shop. The two of them laughing over dinner at restaurants Bob couldn't afford anymore on his retirement income. When Bob confronted Linda with the evidence, she didn't even try to deny it. "I'm filing for divorce," Linda said simply. "I've already talked to a lawyer." The legal proceedings were brutal. Bob tried to use Linda's affair as leverage, hoping to protect at least some of their assets. But Ohio's no-fault divorce laws didn't care about adultery when it came to property division. Everything they'd built together over 35 years, the house, their savings, Bob's retirement fund, was split right down the middle. Bob watched his life's work disappear on paper. The 4-bedroom colonial where they'd raised their kids, where Bob had planned to spend his golden years, was sold. Linda got half the proceeds and bought a small condo across town. Bob's share barely covered the deposit on a cramped 1-bedroom apartment in a complex that had seen better days. The final insult came when Linda closed Blooms and Petals and moved to Arizona with David, who apparently had a grown daughter in Phoenix. Just like that, she was gone, not just from Bob's life, but from their entire community. On the day Bob moved into his new apartment, he sat on a folding chair in the middle of his empty living room and felt something he'd never experienced before: complete and utter aloneness. At 62 years old, he was starting over with nothing: no wife, no home, no daily purpose, and barely enough money to cover his basic expenses. That first night, Bob heated up a frozen dinner and ate it standing at his kitchen counter. No conversation, no shared stories from the day, no familiar sounds of Linda moving around their home. Just silence and the hum of the refrigerator. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, Bob cried. Rock Bottom, it turns out, is a surprisingly quiet place. Bob spent the first 3 months in his new apartment barely leaving except for grocery runs and doctor appointments. He'd wake up with no reason to get dressed, spend hours mindlessly watching TV, and go to bed early because there was nothing else to do. His kids Sarah and Michael, both living in other states with families of their own, called regularly. But Bob found it hard to explain what his days were like. How do you tell your successful adult children that their father spends most afternoons staring out the window of a depressing apartment complex? Depression is a sneaky thing. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It just settles over you like dust, making everything feel gray and pointless. But sometimes, salvation comes from the most unexpected places. Bob was at the Cuyahoga County Community Services office one Thursday morning, trying to figure out if he qualified for any assistance programs, when he saw a flyer on the bulletin board: Senior Employment Opportunities, earn extra income while staying active. The job was simple part-time custodial work for the city parks department. It wasn't glamorous, basically picking up trash, maintaining walking paths, and doing light maintenance around public spaces. But it was something. More importantly, it was a reason to get up in the morning. Bob's first day was humbling. Here he was, a man who'd once managed multi-million-dollar budgets, picking up cigarette butts in Riverside Park. But as the weeks went on, something unexpected happened. The physical work felt good. Being outside, moving his body, seeing the immediate results of his efforts, there was something satisfying about it that his old desk job had never provided. Plus, the other guys on the crew were decent folks. They didn't pry into Bob's personal life or treat him like he was too good for the work. One afternoon, while cleaning up around the community center, Bob noticed a sign advertising free classes for seniors: art therapy, computer skills, financial planning, and photography. Bob had always been interested in photography but had never had time to pursue it seriously. On a whim, he signed up. The instructor, Maria Santos, was a retired newspaper photographer in her 70s who had a no-nonsense approach to teaching. Photography, she told the small group of students, isn't about expensive equipment or technical perfection. It's about seeing the world differently. Bob borrowed an old digital camera from the community center's equipment loan program and started experimenting. At first, his photos were terrible, blurry, poorly composed, forgettable. But Maria was patient, and slowly, Bob began to develop an eye for interesting shots. He started carrying the camera with him during his park's maintenance work. A cardinal perched on a snow-covered bench. Sunlight filtering through autumn leaves. An elderly man feeding ducks while his grandson watched in fascination. For the first time since his divorce, Bob felt genuinely excited about something. The photography class led to joining the West Side Camera Club, a group of amateur photographers who met monthly to share their work and plan photo walks around Cleveland. These weren't just people who happened to take pictures, they were a community of folks who found joy and meaning in capturing moments of beauty. Bob made his first real friends in years. There was Dorothy, a retired teacher who specialized in macro photography of flowers and insects. Jim, a former factory worker who had an amazing eye for street photography. Susan, whose landscape photos could take your breath away. For the first time since Linda left, Bob had people to talk to, places to be, projects to work on. He started looking forward to things again. 2 years later, Bob Wilson stood in the main hall of the Westside Community Center, adjusting the final photograph in his first solo exhibition. The collection was called Second Chances, and it told the story of his neighborhood through his camera lens. There were pictures of kids playing in the apartment complex courtyard where he lived. Portraits of his coworkers taking pride in their daily tasks. Sunset shots from the walking path where he'd started jogging to stay healthy. Each photograph represented something Bob was learning about resilience, about finding beauty in unexpected places. About the difference between being alone and being lonely. The exhibition opening was small but meaningful. Dorothy and Jim were there, of course, along with several other members of the camera club. Maria Santos came and spent a long time studying each photo, nodding approvingly. Even a few of Bob's co-workers from the parks department showed up, curious to see what their quiet colleague had been working on. Bob's daughter Sarah flew in from Denver for the opening. As they walked through the exhibition together, she squeezed his arm. "Dad, I have to tell you something," Sarah said quietly. "When you and Mom got divorced, I was worried you'd just give up. But look at this. Look at what you've created." Bob smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. "You know what's funny? I thought losing everything meant my life was over. But maybe it just meant my real life was finally beginning." Later that evening, after the last visitors had left and the community center was closing up, Bob got word through a mutual acquaintance about Linda. The news wasn't good. Her relationship with David had ended badly apparently. He'd been involved with several other women throughout their time together. Linda had moved on again, this time to somewhere in Florida, trying to start over once more. 2 years ago, hearing news like that would have sent Bob into an emotional tailspin. He would have felt vindicated, or sad, or angry, or some confusing combination of all three. But now, Bob felt something different. Compassion, maybe, and a quiet gratitude that their paths had diverged. Standing in his small apartment that night, looking at the camera equipment that had become such an important part of his life, Bob realized something profound. He'd spent 35 years thinking that happiness meant having someone else complete him, fix his problems, share his dreams. But real freedom, real contentment came from discovering that he was already complete. That he could create meaning, find purpose, build relationships, and yes, even find joy, all on his own. The man who'd felt like an empty shell just 2 years earlier had learned to fill himself up. Bob picked up his camera and walked out onto his small balcony. The sun was setting over Cleveland, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that would make a beautiful photograph. But instead of immediately reaching for a shot, Bob just stood there and appreciated the moment. Tomorrow, he had plans. A photo walk with the camera club. A shift at the park where he'd been promoted to crew supervisor. Dinner with Dorothy, who'd become not just a friend, but someone he genuinely cared about. No pressure, no expectations, just two people who enjoyed each other's company. For the first time in his 64 years, Bob Wilson was exactly where he wanted to be, fully, completely, contentedly himself. And that, he realized, was the best kind of freedom there is. The lesson in Bob's story isn't just about surviving divorce or starting over in your 60s. It's about the fundamental truth that we are all complete human beings on our own. Capable of growth, of creating meaning, of finding joy, regardless of our relationship status or life circumstances. Sometimes, losing everything we thought we needed is exactly how we discover everything we actually are.